We are joined by Stephanie Canizales, Assistant Professor of Sociology at UC Berkeley and author of Sin Padres Ni Papeles, Unaccompanied Migrant Youth Coming of Age in the United States, which is something I'm very excited to discuss. But I do want to start by saying thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Of course, yeah, the pleasure is all ours. So to start by kind of setting the foundation of what we'll get into, could you explain the research that went into the book?
Yeah, so Sin Padres Ni Papeles is a study of the coming of age stories, the immigrant integration stories of unaccompanied and undocumented migrant youth because of their intersecting statuses as unaccompanied and undocumented end up as low-wage workers. So I tell from the perspective of 75 young people that I interviewed, but also from my perspective as a researcher that spent 6 years in community with these people, tell a story of how those two things, immigrant integration and coming of age, occur simultaneously, and what it means for immigrant youth who are strangers to a society, but also transitioning to adulthood. So sometimes strangers to themselves, right? As they're getting to know themselves, how they manage those things independent of a caregiver, an adult, a parent.
Yeah, and then the only other question I want to ask before we jumped into some of the specific things you talk in the book was I was curious if there were any I don't know if myths would be the word, common like myths or something that you hear a lot that maybe were disproven from the research or even just being able to talk to the use, maybe even if whether they're obvious or things that could have even came as
Yeah.
a surprise to you.
I hope that when readers engage with the book, that the whole book comes through as trying to debunk every possible myth under the sun about immigrant youth, particularly about undocumented immigrant communities broadly, but also about what it means to be a child in the U.S. So one of the main sort of myths I attempt to debunk through the writing of the book is that all migrant children are growing up in parent-led households, and that institutions that sort of assume that there is an adult that acts as the connector between the child and broader society. And when we assume that those people are there, we miss opportunities to serve these kids and really meet them where they are in their very vulnerable and high risk needs. So the assumption that there are adults looking after kids is one of them, and also the assumption that immigrant kids grow up in schools, right? We assume also that kids have access to teachers and principals and counselors and even peers that are all like-minded and sort of moving in the direction of an imagined future as a productive adult citizen, right? So when you have kids that are undocumented and unaccompanied, they're growing up in factories and car washes and restaurant kitchens. Um, and again, tying that back to the absence of the adult. So that's sort of the launching point for the book is if we take away these protective mechanisms of parents, if we take kids out of schools, what happens to them? And the rest of the book really sets out to answer that question.
I think that's an amazing response because it also kind of segues into the next question I want to ask you because I thought it was interesting. You speak of programs like DACA, like SIJ, and how some of these underlying assumptions, like a parent will be present in their life or in their household, isn't always bared out in reality. So I
Yeah.
wanted to know if you could speak to kind of these underlying issues in our system that exist, and if there were any, to the extent that maybe some of the perspectives of the youth on how to address those.
Yeah. So DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, was sort of the attempt to make up for a failed DREAM Act, which was a pathway to citizenship. So we know DACA is a program that provides a period of protection, work authorization, and opportunities for mobility for people who qualify. Qualification is typically based on educational attainment or participation in a school setting. And the kids that I studied were, again, workers. They didn't have that protective adult that was doing the labor, paying the rent, buying the groceries, buying the books. Kids were doing that for themselves, and that often meant that they weren't able to enroll in K through 12 schools. So I talk in the opening of the book about how many of the young people that I spent 6 years with, and this is hundreds of unaccompanied and undocumented teenagers growing up in Los Angeles, they qualified, I mean, on technicalities for DACA, right? They had been in the US since before the age of 16. They had been in the US for the certain number of years. they weren't students, so that was a disqualifier. And they didn't have parents or an adult figure thinking on their behalf. I should save paperwork, right? Like I should save documentation that shows, that proves that my child has been here or that we have as a family been present in the US. So kids didn't qualify for DACA. And even if they would have wanted to, if they turned themselves in or like expose themselves as a potentially DACA qualifying young person, they wouldn't be able to work. Therefore, they can't pay the rent, they can't support their families, so on and so forth. And then SIJ is also the special immigrant juvenile status, which unaccompanied kids in the US qualify for if they're able to prove neglect or abandonment by a parent. Again, I'm talking about people who migrated to support themselves in the US, but also support their behind families. So this idea that you would claim that family is neglecting, abusing, abandoning you, it's a sort of distorted view of how unaccompanied child migration comes to be and how children relate to the people in their network. Yeah, and that child migration is a response to the fragmentation of family, which is another myth, right? And I try to show in the book that children are often migrating as an act of family care and cohesion, right? It's how they keep their families together.
Yeah, and that is a part that I did want to get into, but first I wanted to kind of talk about another large part of what you speak on in the book, which is incorporation. Could you kind of expand on the different aspects that go into this, and then also how I'm sure maybe like harmful rhetoric or things like that could affect this process?
Yeah, I love this. I love this setup for our conversation because I really do try to set out like these are all the things we have sort of told ourselves about how immigrants come to be in US society, how immigrant children grow up. And incorporation is really the one sociological sort of um, pillar that I try to chip away at over and over and over in the book. So, incorporation, as we understood it prior to the publication of my book, was a socioeconomic outcome. So, we sort of ask ourselves, are immigrants incorporated? And it's a sort of yes or no question. And then, if yes, what makes them incorporated? And it's typically things again like education, socioeconomic status, income, occupational mobility, home ownership, business ownership. And then we say, oh, that person is successfully incorporated. If a person doesn't achieve those things, high levels of education, wealth accumulation, we say that person is not incorporated. And then we design immigration policies to reward people who achieve socioeconomic status and to punish people that do not achieve those markers. So, what I have tried to show in Sin Padres Ni Papeles is how for immigrants broadly, but for unaccompanied youth specifically, incorporation is a material process. It is a process of adjustment to the everyday sort of function of society, right? Like integrating into housing and work and schools and community. But it's also the emotional process of especially as teenagers, sort of balancing one's emotions out, right? Being able to self-regulate, being able to self-soothe, and feeling a sense of companionship that soothes the initial loneliness that they feel upon arrival as unaccompanied kids in the US.
Yeah, and another part of that, and you kind of went into work a little bit there, that I wanted to discuss because I don't think it's talked about enough in these kinds of conversations or circles, is the exploitation or dangers that migrants as a whole, but especially migrant youth, can face in the labor market, working predominantly low-wage jobs and these kinds of things. Could you kind of go into detail on that for us?
Yeah. How far back do we want to go? Because I can take us into the 1930s and the 1970s.
As far back as you
So,
want.
yeah, so for as long as the economy has been transforming, transitioning, we know that in deindustrialization, um, following the Great Depression and deindustrialization, we have heavily relied on immigrants and other populations that we are able to, because of their vulnerability, exploit for low wages for the sake of gaining more capital. And higher profits for corporations. So, undocumented immigrants have been the target of a lot of these undesirable, highly exploitative, low paying jobs. And rightfully so, they're undesirable, right? It's like punishing farm work or very grueling factory work, things that we don't want to do, right? But immigrants, because of their legal status and the denial of legal protection and legal status, are vulnerable in the US and therefore at high risk of exploitation in these industries. Typically, it was single men that were working these jobs, then women joined in the 80s and 90s, families in the 2000s. This is when we started to see the conversation about DACA and the DREAM Act, right? We have all these undocumented kids in the US. Um, as the sort of drive of these industries to the bottom and attempt to accumulate higher profits, we look for increasingly vulnerable people to exploit. And now that happens to be children. Um, so when we see reports in the news about high rates of child migrant labor in auto manufacturing industries, poultry sanitation, any sort of meat packing, that is a direct sort of, it comes from that lineage of exploiting undocumented workers and the slow devaluation of immigrant life, including immigrant children's childhood, which in the US, we supposedly very much value how sacred childhood is and um, how morally dependent and in need of protection children are. But that isn't the case for a brown, undocumented child, right?
Which is a very sad reality, indeed.
Yeah.
I'm curious if, I guess, whether through your research, your kind of expertise in the field, or even some of the interviews you did, if there were any solutions to this kind of monopoly-like power we see that allows these conditions to be imposed on migrants in the workforce to kind of pull away from that and give them more of a sense of equality or true like integration.
From the children's perspective, you mean?
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, so young people would often talk about in my interviews and even just like in conversations to one another when I was sort of just hanging out about their understanding that educational attainment, but education as English language learning was especially important in being able to understand what was happening in the workplace with non-Spanish language speakers, in being able to defend themselves and being able to report incidences of abuse or wage theft. So one of the things that came up through the research was the importance in investing in community-based organizations that provide alternatives to K through 12 school. So if kids are working 16 hours a day because they need to pay rent or food or to survive, generally speaking, they're not going to school, which is from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., right? They're at work at those times. So alternative educational spaces after work, on weekends, in community-based spaces, or investing in adult English language night classes, which a lot of my participants enrolled or attempted to enroll or wanted to at one point enroll in adult English language night classes where they could learn the English language. So I think that is one immediate sort of response that young people said, if I could only study, right? Like even being able to just defend yourself when someone calls you an idiot immigrant at work, um, that would that would be an immediate solution for them.
Something I was happy that you brought up earlier in our conversation was kind of fragmented families and how this is kind of a myth, because I know, and you talk about it in your book as well, a lot of these unaccompanied youth are doing so to financially aid family that might not have came with
Mhm.
them. I'm kind of curious what kind of extra burden this could place on these unaccompanied or undocumented youth who do have these transnational ties that are working to kind of, aid their family who couldn't come with them, whether it be economic directly or even like social or just the different ways that it could affect them in additional ways some people don't think of.
Yeah. Um, so part of this sort of theorizing incorporation as material and emotional processes was this exact thing, right? The relationship to the families that they left behind. I'll start by saying that even in instances where there were fragmented families prior to migration, and this is something I explore in the book, kids who migrated to flee their family, right? Either because of domestic abuse or family members had been persecuted, or there was an intentional sort of separation from the family. Um, there was an emotional burden that kids carried, even when they knew materially, and they didn't have the obligation to send money back, right? Um, there was the emotional burden, that the trauma that many of the young people that I interviewed and met throughout my 6 years of this research would talk about. Still those moments where they could remember the abuse, or having seen violence, or experiencing that abandonment. Um, and because, again, these kids are embedded in workplaces for 12, 16 hours a day, they're not going to therapy, getting mental health support. They're not. I develop in the book this idea of desahogo, or unburdening. Young people would say, um, se necesita desahogar. You need to just unburden. And it's a practice that kids develop. I think I experienced it at home. When you are growing up in supportive parent-led households, you talk about your day and you tell, the gossip, and you tell all of the things that happen. Yeah, a lot of these young people never in their years being in the US do they encounter experiences of unburdening of that desahogo. So even when kids are not sending money home, there is a sort of emotional toll of that family separation. For kids who, and a majority of my participants were sending money back home, they migrated. There's so many ways I can answer this, but they migrated in part because they saw the suffering. So there were memories people would tell me about their moms crying every night, or their siblings being hungry, or their grandma getting sick, or their dad being abusive to the family. There's like specific memories that they thought, I will work to change that circumstance, right? Like if I work in the US and I send money back home, my dad will experience so much distress that he'll drink and then abuse us. So there was always this sort of connection. If I work and send money home, my mom will stop crying, or my siblings will go to school, or my family will eat. So there were these moments of suffering that young people often recalled. So even when they were experiencing high levels of exploitation, poverty, distress, that material component, right? They sort of rationalize with themselves why they would persist in those conditions based on the memory of suffering. Um, and then on top of that, I talk in the book about this sort of realization that the US is a hyper commodified society, that they had sort of made calculations upon migration that they would be in the US for 2, 3, 5 years. But I'm talking to them 12 years after migration. And a part of that is because they say, like, I didn't know I needed quarters for laundry. I didn't know I was going to need to take the bus everywhere. I didn't know there would be all these holes in my pocket, right? And I wouldn't be accumulating those resources to alleviate the poverty my family was facing in the time that I did. So that's how the transition into adulthood sort of inadvertently happened, in part because young people were trying to survive the hyper commodification and trying to keep promises to left behind families in a society where the cost of living doesn't match the wages we earn, from the middle class all the way down to these unaccompanied young people.
And I'm sure I know there was 6 years of research, numerous interviews. You've probably gotten all kinds of stories from all kinds of youth. A question that I had pertaining to that is, were there any kind of common themes that you heard throughout, whether it be problems, whether it be solutions, just feelings, experiences? Were there any at least somewhat that were shared throughout, like the numerous interviews you did do?
Yeah, there were several themes, and I developed some concepts around them. So maybe I'll organize my response around those. One of them is this idea of work primacy that I develop. What I was describing earlier, that work becomes the thing, the activity that these young people do. It's not socializing in schools, it's not leisure, exploring interests. It's really working to survive. Work becomes the central organizing institution of their lives. If they didn't make a friend at work, if they didn't gain knowledge at work, if they didn't make money at work, they weren't doing anything else outside of work that really pushed them into a different future. I was actually having a conversation yesterday with a student that asked me, like, do you still keep in touch with people now? What are they doing now? And I said, unfortunately, my theory of work primacy is um, right, in that people are now in their 30s and they're still garment workers, they're still car washers, they're still trying to make ends meet. So work really becomes the identity, the role, the activity that organizes everything that they do and how they experience US society. The other concept that I develop in the book is one of the emergent frame of reference. And I use this concept to describe how young people sort of make sense of where they fit in US society. And a lot of my participants who didn't know each other, and I had one-on-one interviews with people, and they would say, you come to the US thinking that all the other kids are going to be working. And so young people come to terms with the fact that they're at work surrounded by adults. They're like, where are the kids? Oh, everyone is at school, or they go to church and the kids are with adults, right? Like kids are with their parents or kids are with families. So coming to terms with the different sort of structures of childhood in their home countries where kids aren't in school, kids are working, families are fragmented and suffering all kinds of violence in everyday life. And then here, and kids are at school and adults are at work, and everyone, like family looks different. That sort of heightened the emotional toll of all of the material suffering. It meant it, one person said, like, it hurts your feelings, right? Like you're hungry, you're struggling to pay rent, your body hurts all day. And then on top of that, your feelings are hurt because now you realize I'm alone as a child and all these other kids have parents. That's sort of an idealized version, right? We know there are homeless youth and runaway youth and foster youth in the US, and things look a little more complicated in the actual landscape of childhood. But that's what they would say, sort of as a common experience, where you come here and you're like, damn.
Yeah.
Like I'm unaccompanied, like I'm actually unaccompanied, and all these other kids have their parents, and that hurts my feelings. Because they are just teenagers at the end of the day too. And then the one thing I sort of draw at the end of the book is this idea of success, where because young people didn't have parent-led households, K through 12 schools that protected them as they were coming of age, the markers of success, there were no high school diplomas, there were no college acceptance letters to say like, oh, look, I made it or I am making it. Young people really talked about being able to give back to their families as a marker of success. Keeping those promises, even as they suffered through it, was a marker of success. And being able to manage emotions was a marker of success.
And so the question I wanted to end on was kind of zooming out from things directly related to the book, but more related to the topic as a larger picture. And we spoke a little bit about the rhetoric and how it can be harmful. And I know nowadays, I don't want to say worse necessarily, but at least more on the forefront, this kind of rhetoric is
Right.
existing. So what do you think needs to happen to kind of move us past that point to where like humanity and dignity and these kinds of things are re-included into these conversations?
I think the answer is embedded in the question. Like, we really need to center humanity and dignity. I cannot, I said I wasn't going to mention any politicians, but here I am. But when Biden came into office and he made this promise that he would take a more humane approach, and it was the first time in 4 years that we heard someone say something related to humanity, and that promise wasn't delivered on. And then again, you're hearing this discourse around like the deviant, illegal deportation now. And it's all about the criminalization and the threat of the immigrant. And my work, young people said, and I include these quotes and these stories in the book, young people say, we come here to take care of our families. We come here with goals. We come here with an imagined future. And they talk about having sacrificially given to US society, or in the case of my participants in Los Angeles, having like constructed some of the new apartment complexes, sewing clothes that people are wearing on their backs, even on the red carpet, right? Like people that do like embroidered beadwork, and they knew that it was going to be at an award ceremony and having gotten paid $15 to make that dress, right? Or people that talk about serving food to Los Angeles residents or tourists, whoever. Their young people can point to sort of moments of interaction with the US economy or US society or culture and say, like, I'm an active, positively contributing member of this society. So I think listening to immigrants, I keep saying this over and over as I talk about this book, we need to stop taking this sort of top down, what does the law say and how do people meet the requirements of the law, and take a bottom up, how are people experiencing everyday life under the law, and what are they saying about the pressure points, or what are they saying about how they find relief in under that pressure, and can we actually draw on children and youth voices to come up with new solutions, as opposed to being the adults in the room that show up and we're like, this is what kids need to do, right? But really asking, like, what should we be doing to meet you where you're at? And it might not always feel cozy. Like, the solution might not always feel cozy, but young people know better than the rest of us how to solve this unaccompanied child crisis and the rise of child labor in the US.
I completely agree. I think a lot could be said about being proactive rather than reactive, and listening rather than judging, these kinds of things.
Right.
A lot of people
Yeah.
could learn from doing that more, I'm sure.
Yeah.
In a lot of different
In
aspects of life.
everyday life.
Yes, literally. So I always like to give people the chance at the end, if there were like any points you did want to drive home, maybe we didn't touch on, and then definitely let people know where to get the book. Like if you have like a website, anything like that, you can go ahead and shout it out.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you can get the book on Amazon, or I like to point people to Bookshop, because bookshop.com, because they do support independent bookstores and ship from local bookstores based on your shipping address. But anyway, a final point that I really want to drive home, I think, is the intention of the book, which I couldn't include every single story I heard, but I really hope that when readers engage with it, they can feel that humanity, right? Try to envision the portraits that I paint, either of the place where I did the interview or what that young person looked like and how their expressions changed throughout our conversation. But we will read a lot of stories, hear a lot of debates that mention these false narratives of who immigrants are in the US. So I think really taking into account, this was a 6 year long study that didn't intend to be what it ended up being. But I hope people can sit with the product that turned out in Sin Padres, Sin Papeles. And if anything resonates, leave a review
Yeah.
on Amazon or wherever else
Yes.
you get the book. I would really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I'll have a link for anyone's watching that wants to check that out. I'll have a link to the book in the description. I want to thank you again for what was an amazing conversation, sharing your expertise and giving us some of your time today.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. I appreciate it.
Awesome. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day as well.